Welcome to the Four Witnesses of the Messiah, Chapter 6, Session 13b, the Crucifixion of our Lord. This is the section of Scripture in which the accuracy of the Word can be vividly demonstrated. One can clearly see how Orthodox traditions are incorrect. And that has been an eye-opener for many believers, which has convinced them to switch to the truth. Because one cannot get 3 days and 3 nights between Good Friday and Easter Sunday morning, no matter how you count. So, we know accurately that Jesus died on Wednesday in the middle of the week, which fits with the Daniel 9 prophecy, and that he arose still on the third day, which would have been Saturday, just before the stars appeared. That's after sunset, but the stars appeared, and that signaled the next day beginning. The next day then would be Sunday. So, Jesus actually was dead a bit longer than 72 hours. For the 3 days and 3 nights figure is him, quote, in the heart of the earth, unquote. So that is, he was buried for 3 days and 3 nights. The Last Supper, if we go back to the timeline, was Monday night. And Jesus at Gethsemane was early Tuesday by Hebrew reckoning, but still Monday evening by our time. Then the arrest of Jesus was right after that in Gethsemane, and Peter's denials occurred during that night, late Monday night, our time, but Tuesday according to Hebrew reckoning. Then, early Tuesday morning before dawn, Jesus appeared before Annas and Caiaphas. Then in Matthew 27:1, Mark 15:1, and Luke 22:66, the so-called trial before the Sanhedrin was when the morning came. So that would have been Tuesday morning. Then Jesus was brought before Pilate the first time. John 18:28 indicates that this was still before the Passover. So the Last Supper couldn't have been the Passover meal. Then Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, and Herod sent him back to Pilate. And then the Jewish mob intimidated Pilate into condemning Jesus to death. Ren will cover that next week. John 19:14 documents that what I just spoke of, was at the 6th hour on the, quote, preparation of the Passover. So this also was before the Passover. That would have been noon on Tuesday. So, now we pick up the account at the next event 6.45. Jesus was led away to be crucified. Event 6.45. Luke 23:25b says, but he, Pilate, delivered Jesus to their will, and that was to be tortured. Mark 15:15b, and delivered Jesus when he had scourged him, when Pilate had scourged him, to be crucified, and the soldiers led him away into the hall called the Praetorium, and they called together the whole band, the whole cohort. Verse 17, and they clothed him with purple and platted a crown of thorns and put it about his head and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they smote him on the head with a reed, and did spit upon him, and bowing their knees worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple from him, and put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Verse 21, and they compelled one Simon a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Matthew 27:26b also speaks of this event. When Pilate had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. That scourging was probably 40 lashes save one, and the lash probably was like a cat of 9 tails with bone in the ends, so it opened up sores on his back. Then the soldiers, verse 27 of the governor, took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band, cohort of soldiers. They stripped him, put on a scarlet robe, and when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. They bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him and took the reed and smote him on the head. Matthew 27:31a. And after they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him. Now, the next chronological marker later on in the record is the 3rd hour, 9 a.m. on Wednesday, when they arrived at Golgotha and nailed Jesus to the cross. Therefore, this account that Jesus was in the Praetorium Hall with the whole cohort of Roman soldiers means that Jesus was tortured for about 20 hours. That started at noon on Tuesday and ended at 9 a.m. Wednesday. A cohort was a standard tactical military unit of the Roman legion, generally 1/10 of a legion. It usually consisted of 480 soldiers, and it says the whole cohort came together. They probably did every evil thing imaginable to him except to break his bones. This was standard practice in crucifixions to quote-unquote soften up the victim to make them experience the greatest amount of pain on the cross. But one thing they did not do was break any bones. That was so the victims' bodies would not fall apart on the cross. So Jesus endured this suffering for hours because he loved us. It just highlights how they made fun of him and they put the crown of thorns on him and all that. But 480 men for 20 hours. Oh my goodness. Jesus endured the suffering because he loved us. The pictures that we have of Jesus with the crown of thorns on his head, they do not come close to depicting how bad it was. Even the Passion of the Christ movie does not even show how bad it was. Isaiah 53 says, "His visage was marred more than any man." When they were done with him, he looked like hamburger. Luke 23:26. And they laid hold upon one Simon of Cyrene, coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. So Jesus bore the cross as much as he could, and then when he couldn't bear it anymore, after Jesus, then they grabbed an onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, and the Roman occupiers could do that. They could make anyone bear a burden. You, carry this. The rule was, just so it wouldn't be too abusive, is that it could be no longer than a mile. That's what Jesus was referring to in the Sermon on the Mount, where he talked about 1 mile or 2. You remember that? In Luke 23:27, and there followed him a great company of people and of the women, which also bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning unto them, the women, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming, in the which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, into the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And there were also 2 other malefactors led with him to be put to death. Matthew 27:31 also picks this up. They led him away to crucify him. Verse 32, and they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, of Simon. John 19:16, then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. So then we have the next event, event 6.46. This is event 6.46, Jesus crucified at Golgotha with 2 malefactors at the 3rd hour. Luke 23:33 is where this picks up. And when they were come to the place, which is called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the malefactors, one on the right hand, and the other on the left. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they parted his raiment and cast lots. Ren brought up last week that this Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, is not in some texts. That is omitted in P75 and Codex Vaticanus, but it is in the original writing of Codex Sinaiticus and also Alexandrinus. So if you look at the external evidence with that, it's a toss-up whether it was there or not. I would prefer to leave it there because that is what Jesus preached when he said, pray for them that despitefully use you. So I think that it belongs there, even though some people may say that the textual tradition is that it shouldn't. But it's really, textually, it's a toss-up. Luke 23:35, and the people stood beholding, and the rulers also with them derided him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he be Christ, the chosen of God. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming to him and offering him vinegar. Well, if you were all bloody and thirsty, if they gave you that, it would sting like crazy. It was like a trick. It was just an evil trick. Verse 37, and saying, if you be the king of the Jews, save yourself. Then a superscription also was written over him in letters in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. This is King of the Jews. So Mark 15:22 through 26 basically says the same thing, except in verse 25, it gives the chronological timestamp that this was the 3rd hour and they crucified him. Then Matthew 27:33, the 3rd hour would be like 9 a.m. Matthew 27:33 through 37 basically has the same information. So let's go to John 19:17. John 19:17, and he bearing his cross went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and 2 others with him on either side, one and Jesus in the midst. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And this title then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh unto the city. And it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. See, where the Romans crucified people was probably at a crossroads. This execution that the Romans did was for show and for intimidation. So everyone would know what the cost of going against the Romans would be. You would be crucified, and it was an extremely painful death. What caused the death actually was asphyxiation, because after a while the person could not hold themselves up to breathe. But they were so racked with pain because they had been softened up by the Roman soldiers that the dying on the cross was just terrible, arduous. And then they usually left them to rot on the cross and for their bodies to be picked clean by birds and animals. It was just a terrible thing, but it was very intimidating that people knew what would happen if you went against the Romans. But the chief priest didn't like that sign. In verse 21, they said to Pilate, don't write that King of the Jews stuff. But he said, I'm King of the Jews. And Pilate answered, what I've written. Deal with it. So then event 6.47 is 2 thieves were crucified with Jesus. Mark 15:27. Mark 15:27. And with him they crucified 2 thieves, one on his right hand and the other on his left. Now, the way that Dan Stalker has laid out all of this in his chronology, it's easy to see that the thieves and the malefactors were different individuals. See, the 2 thieves were different from the 2 malefactors. Luke 23:32 says the malefactors were led with him. The 2 thieves were crucified later. But the scripture which really proves that there were 4 crucified with Jesus is John 19:32 and 33. John 19:32. Then came the soldiers and broke the legs of the first and of the other, which was crucified with him. The priests told the Romans that they did not want the bodies to be on the crosses during the Sabbath, during the high day. So to hasten their death, they broke their legs so they wouldn't be able to hold themselves up. But when they came to Jesus, they saw he was dead already, and they didn't break his legs. So, in verse 32, the soldiers came and brake the legs of the first. That would have been one of the thieves. And of the other which was crucified with him. Well, earlier it said the malefactors were crucified with him. So they got to the number 2 person, and that what had to be a malefactor. And then number 3, when Jesus was in the midst, when they arrived at Jesus, they saw he was dead already. So John 19:32 and 33 proves that there were 4 crucified with Jesus. 2 malefactors, 1 on either side, and 2 thieves, 1 on either side. Because it just doesn't make sense that they wouldn't arrive at Jesus in the midst in sequence. See, it doesn't make sense that they go to the other side and see the other guy. No, they follow the sequence. Thief, malefactor, and then Jesus in the midst. Mark 15:28, and the scripture was fulfilled which saith that he was numbered with the transgressors, and they that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads, and saying, Ah, thou that destroys the temple, and builds it in 3 days, save yourself, come down from the cross. Likewise all the chief priests mocking, and said among themselves with the scribes, He saved others, himself he can't save. Let Christ the King of Israel descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Matthew 27:38 through 43 basically says the same thing. So then we have the next event 6.48. 6.48. The 2 thieves and 1 malefactor revile Jesus at the 6th hour. This would have been noon. John 19:23. John 19:23. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without a seam, woven from the top throughout. And they said, therefore among themselves, let's not rend it, but cast lots for it, and whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which saith, they parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things therefore the soldiers did. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. But when Jesus therefore saw his mother, and the disciple standing by, whom he loved, that would have been Lazarus, he said to his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her unto his own home. So basically, he assigned Lazarus to look after his mom. Then Mark 15:32b, then they that were crucified with him reviled him, and when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Matthew 27:44 agrees. The thieves also which were crucified with him cast the same in his teeth. So they reviled him too, both thieves. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. So both thieves reviled him, but we see from Luke only 1 of the malefactors. So that's another proof. The thieves and the malefactors were not the same. Luke 23:39. Luke 23:39. And one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him, saying, If you be the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Don't you fear God, seeing that thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive due reward for our deeds. But this man hath done nothing amiss. And he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So he was a believer. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Now, verse 43 is a controversial verse, because did Jesus say that that day he would be with him in paradise after they died? Or did he say to him today, you shall in the future be with me in paradise? Well, there was no punctuation marks in the earliest manuscripts, so the placement of the comma is not God-breathed. It could go before the word today or after the word today, but the placement makes a big difference. So what do? Should we just argue about the verse? No. We can figure it out by using biblical concurrence. We know from other scriptures about death, especially Ecclesiastes 9, that there's no consciousness in death. The idea that one goes to heaven or hell immediately upon death actually is from the Apocrypha. The book of Enoch is the worst offender in that respect. The word paradise also is the key. If you do a study of paradise, it's only used of Eden or of the future in the book of Revelation. So, since paradise is in the future, they couldn't go back in time to Eden, of course. So, since paradise is in the future, the comma must come after the word today. Verily I say unto you today, comma, thou shalt in the future be with me in paradise. That's how it fits. They don't go to heaven or hell immediately upon death, because in what legitimate court anywhere in the universe are rewards or punishments meted out before the trial? They're going to be tried at the resurrection and then rewarded or punished. So Luke 23:44, it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour, and the sun was darkened. Now, I believe we have looked at the possibility that this could be a solar eclipse, but there were no solar eclipses at this time period. So I believe that this darkening was by dark clouds, just really, really dark storm clouds. So event 6.49 is the next event. This is Jesus died at the 9th hour. Luke 23:45b. And the veil of the temple was rent in the midst, and Jesus had cried with a loud voice and said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. This is documenting, actually, that Jesus died twice. He died spiritually and physically. That was just like Adam. He paid the like price that Adam paid when the dominion of the world was transferred to the adversary, the twofold death of a sinless man. So he died spiritually. Adam died spiritually, for God had said in that very day that they partook of that wrong tree, they should surely die. So they died somehow. Well, they died spiritually. They lost their spirit. And then subsequently, they died physically. The twofold death of a sinless man was the price that was paid to transfer the dominion, and the twofold death of a sinless man was what was paid to get it back. Wow. Mark 15:34. Mark 15:34. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Ren is going to teach about that next week. Verse 35, and some of them that stood by, when they heard it, said, Behold, he calls Elias. Verse 36, and one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar and put it on a reed and gave him to drink, saying, Let alone, let's see whether Elias will come and take him down. And then Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. And the veil of the temple was rent in two from the top to the bottom. And when the centurion which stood over against him saw that he so cried out and gave up the ghost, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God. There were also the women looking on afar off, among whom was Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the Less, and of Joseph and Salome, who also when he was in Galilee followed him and ministered unto him, and many other women which came up with him unto Jerusalem. Matthew 27:46 through Matthew 27:53, 51 is about the same, so we're going to skip over that. But Matthew 27:52 and 53 I got to read, because it says, we'll read verse 51, when right after Jesus yielded it up to ghost, and behold, the veil of the temple was rent in two from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. Verse 52, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. Now, verse 52 and 53 are really strange, but there's no textual attestation that I know of that says they were added, but I believe they were. I believe this was an early addition to the text, because it doesn't make sense. It says the earthquake opened the graves and the bodies arose, but they didn't come out till 3 days later at the resurrection. That does not make sense. Well, what were they doing in the grave after they arose but didn't come out? Were they playing tiddlywinks? I don't know. It also breaks the rules regarding death. I mean, everybody stays dead until they're raised in a resurrection. And there's only 4 resurrections. The resurrection of Jesus, the gathering together, the resurrection of the just, and the resurrection of the unjust. Everyone who has died gets up in one of those. And also, in verse 53, it talks about Jerusalem as the holy city. That sounds pretty hokey to me. So, I believe verses 52 and 53 were an early addition to the text. Maybe if we find any textual attestation, I'll let you know. But Matthew 27:54, now when the centurion and they that were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, Truly this was a Son of God. And many women were there, beholding afar off, which followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering unto him, among which was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's children. Now, this earthquake, they actually have evidence of this earthquake in the strata of sediments from the Dead Sea. What's happened at the Dead Sea is a lot of the water is gone now from the Dead Sea, and it has receded quite a ways from where it was. And so there are areas now that are exposed that before were underwater and now are not. And they have done excavations in this area of sediment. and they have seen layers like rings of a tree. Except when there was an earthquake, then these layers are broken up by fault lines. And they can tell when the earthquake occurred, because the fault lines are then covered up by new layers later. So the crack is covered up by more layers. And they have found when these were. If you Google the Christ quake, you'll see this information. And geologists have compared their findings with biblical information, including the chronology of the reign of Pontius Pilate. And there were 2 earthquakes that occurred during that time. One of them they date exactly to 31 AD. The other one occurred during the reign of Pontius Pilate. And it is this other one, I believe, that occurred when Jesus was crucified. Now, what the 2 scholars, the geologists, did is they assumed that the other one occurred on Good Friday, and so they give it a date of Friday, April 3rd in 33 AD. They said that's the most likely date of the crucifixion. But in the article, they have a bunch of asterisks there, because this is speculation. They knew that this earthquake happened during the reign of Pontius Pilate, and so then they put that date on it. But I can put the date on it also at April 28th, 28 AD, which would have been Wednesday. So, very interesting that they have proven that there was an earthquake that occurred during that era. Now, what the earthquake did is it tore the curtain that led to the Holy of Holies in two, and that represented the way into the presence of God was made accessible. It's just amazing. So, John 19:28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. There was a vessel full of vinegar. They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it on a hyssop and put it to his mouth. And when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. He bowed his head and he gave up the ghost. Now, here's another pivotal scripture, John 19:31. The Jews therefore, because it was the preparation that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was a high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. Now, this verse is what people use to say that Jesus died on Friday, the day before the Sabbath. But you can't get 3 days and 3 nights between Good Friday and Easter Sunday morning. And this Sabbath that it talks about, for that Sabbath was a high day, that parenthesis doesn't make any sense if the weekly Sabbath was being described, because that already was a high day. It only makes sense if it's speaking of a special high day, and that would have been the first day of unleavened bread. That's also called a Sabbath. So Thursday would have been a Sabbath, and they didn't want the bodies on the crosses on that high day, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that's why they broke the legs of the people who were on the cross to hasten their death. So they came to Jesus, and they saw that he was dead already, and they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. And he said, and bear record, and this record is true, and he knows that he saith this true, that you might believe. Medically, it's like Jesus died of a broken heart, is what the medical proof of that would have been. Verse 36, for these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled, a bone of him shall not be broken. And again another scripture saith, that they shall look on him whom they have pierced. Now, I think maybe I may have skipped a page here in my notes, because there's record of two other drinks that they offered Jesus, and one of the drinks was myrrh mixed with vinegar, and another one was gall mixed with vinegar. And gall is another word for opium. Jesus refused those drinks. They were anesthetics, and he had to bear all of our pains and sorrows. So he did not accept those drinks. So the next event is event 6.50. Event 6.50. Joseph of Arimathea buries Jesus, and the women behold. So John 19:38 is where we start with this. John 19:38. And after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him leave. This is incredible, because normally they leave the bodies up on the crosses to rot. But Joseph of Arimathea came to Pilate, and Pilate gave him leave. He gave him permission, and he took the body of Jesus. Luke 23:50 also talks about this incident. And behold, there was a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a counselor, and he was a good man and just. The same had not consented to the counsel and deed of them. He was of Arimathea. So I agree with Wren that Joseph was probably not present at that council meeting, because it says he did not consent. So, verse 52, this man went unto Pilate and begged the body of Jesus, and he took it down and wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never a man before was laid. And that day was the preparation, Wednesday, and the Sabbath drew on. So it would have been about 5 o'clock or something like that. Verse 55, and the women also which came with him from Galilee followed after and beheld the sepulchre, and also they beheld how his body was laid. That's important, we're going to see. Mark 15:42 has similar information, that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate. Pilate marveled in Mark 15:44 that Jesus was already dead, and so he had the centurion go and check on it, and then the centurion let him know, yes, he's dead, and so he gave the body to Joseph. Joseph had bought fine linen and took Jesus down and wrapped him in the linen and laid him in a sepulchre which was hewn out of a rock, and rolled a stone under the door of the sepulchre. Then verse 47, and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, beheld where he was laid. So, the women saw how he was laid in Luke, and where he was laid in Mark. Matthew 27:57 through 61 has the same information. So, now, this is really interesting, because apparently Joseph of Arimathea was about the only one who literally believed Jesus when he said he would raise the third day. Because Joseph did not give Jesus a quote-unquote proper burial. Actually, because Jesus had made no stipulations regarding his burial, because he believed he was going to be raised, there actually were 3 different parties that tried to bury Jesus. Joseph was one, Nicodemus and his servants was a second, and the women were a third. Now, some people say that Joseph and Nicodemus worked together to bury Jesus. But if that were so, why did the women go out and purchase burial spices? Because Nicodemus used burial spices. So Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had to have worked separately. They actually used 2 different methods of burial. Joseph just used a linen cloth, and the Greek word for that is sindon. Nicodemus used the traditional burial method with athanion. Those are strips of cloth like with mummies. Also, Nicodemus used an exorbitant amount of burial spices. One of the records I checked said it was 100 times what was usually used in one burial. It was just a huge amount of spices. So these burials by Nicodemus and Joseph had to be separate because the women saw how Joseph buried him, and that was unsuitable to them. They saw how and where. So the chronology is Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus in the linen cloth. The women saw it, and they left and went to obtain what was needed for a quote-unquote proper burial. And then after they left, Nicodemus arrived with his servants, and they used the traditional method. So, now actually, when Nicodemus had him buried, Nicodemus probably would not have done the work. His servants did, so that Nicodemus would be ceremonially clean for Passover. So, the next event is 6.51. Nicodemus reburies Jesus, and this is in John 19:39. There came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. That's 100 times what would be used in a normal burial. Then they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes, athanion, with the spices as the manner of Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre wherein never man was laid. There laid they Jesus therein, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. So people think the word they refers to both Joseph and Nicodemus, but it can't. His servants did, because they used different burial methods. So the next event is event 6.52, which is the first day of unleavened bread. The record is Matthew 27:62. Now the next day that followed the day of the preparation. So the day of the preparation is Wednesday. The next day would be Thursday. The chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that this deceiver said that while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people that he is risen from the dead. So the last error should be worse than the first. And Pilate said, you have a watch, you do it. Make it as sure as you can. So he was done with them. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. This is Thursday. That was the high day too. Now, if the crucifixion occurred on Good Friday, where does this fit? Actually, the account of the women who wanted to give Jesus a proper burial disproves a Good Friday crucifixion. Because when did they purchase and prepare the spices? They couldn't do it on the first day of unleavened bread. That was a high day. The marketplace would be closed. They couldn't do it on the weekly Sabbath for the same reason. So when did they purchase and prepare the spices? Well, Event 6.53 says when, which would have been Friday, Nisan the 16th. The women prepare burial spices. Event 6.53. And that's documented in Luke 23:56, where it says the women returned and prepared spices and ointments. And then Mark 16:1, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. What Sabbath was past? Well, it couldn't be the weekly Sabbath, because right that time, when the weekly Sabbath passed, is when they came to the sepulchre with the spices, according to Luke 24:1. So when did they purchase and prepare them? There had to be 2 Sabbaths and an extra day in between. So Wednesday, just before sunset, is when Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. The women saw it. They didn't think that he did it right, so they left to go and purchase spices. And even if they made it to the marketplace before it closed Wednesday, they didn't have time to prepare them. And it says they rested the Sabbath, then they prepared them. So that Sabbath they rested was Thursday, the first day of unleavened bread. Then Friday is the day they prepared the spices. And then was the weekly Sabbath. And after that was when they showed up, after the third day, and they tried to rebury Jesus. But he had already risen, and they didn't need to bury him. So the next event is Event 6.54, the weekly Sabbath, which would be Nisan the 17th. And there's only one scripture there, Luke 23:56, and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. So the women rested the weekly Sabbath day. Next event after that is Event 6.55, which is Saturday, just before the new day starts, which would have been Nisan the 18th, and that is when Jesus arose. Matthew 28:1. Matthew 28:1. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week. So this is still in the end of the Sabbath as it began to dawn. Now, the word dawn seems to mean that it was like sunrise, but the Aramaic word could be of where it was the beginning of the day, not necessarily dawn, because remember, the Hebrew days began at sunset. Not exactly at sunset, but when the stars appeared. That's what Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, says. So, in other words, if there were mountains to the west, the sunset would occur earlier. But if there were no mountains to the west, then sunset would occur later. So to avoid that, they said officially when the day began is when the stars appeared. So that would negate whether there was a mountain to the west or not. See, so it would be about 15 minutes after sunset when the stars appeared. That's what it's talking about here. So Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the sepulchre because they knew there was a watch that was posted there. So they came to check it out. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. And his countenance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and became as dead men. So that took care of the watch for sure. And so next event is event 6.56. Sunday, Nisan the 18th. Mary Magdalene arrives at the tomb, and then she tells Peter. So that's in John 20, verse 1. The first day of the week came Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark. So this is before Easter Sunday morning, unto the sepulchre, and saw the stone taken away from the sepulchre. So she didn't even go in. She saw the stone taken away, and she assumed the worst. She ran and came to Simon Peter, to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we don't know where they've laid him." Peter went forth and the other disciple, and came to the sepulchre, and they ran both together, and the other disciple did outrun Peter, and came first to the sepulchre. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet went he not in. Then came Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and saw the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Now, there's a repetition here about the linen clothes lying 3 times. You know what that is? That's like boldface. It's like underlining. It's like, hey, folks, consider the linen clothes lying. There's something important here, because the word lying means to lay in state, to lay in ceremonial position. So actually, what this was is that the athanion, like mummy cocoon, was still laying in state. It was not like Jesus busted out of the athanion and they were strewn all over the place. No. The cocoon was still intact, but there was no body in it. Well, how did he get out? He dematerialized out of the cocoon and rematerialized beside it, standing in the sepulchre when he folded the napkin that had been on his face and put it aside. That is amazing. That's what Peter saw and believed. See, any other thing, it would have proven that there had been grave robbers and they had taken the body of Jesus. But the cocoon was still intact. That's why the repetition about the linen clothes lying is there. Hey folks, the linen clothes, there's something important here. They were lying in state. So Jesus dematerialized out of the linen clothes and then rematerialized beside them in his new body. And that's exactly how we're going to rise. we will dematerialize out of our coffins and rematerialize on the ground, standing up. And then we'll look up and see Jesus, and we'll take off into the clouds. Wow, that's the example. Woohoo! This linen clothesline and the napkin. There is this colloquial thing that somebody started about the napkin. I'm sorry, it's one of my pet peeves because they don't understand culture when they put this out. And so they said that the napkin was like a dinner napkin, and Jesus folded the dinner napkin, and there was a tradition that when you folded the dinner napkin, you were done eating, and so they say, well, this was a sign that Jesus was coming back. Well, there's no context there for this. Plus, this napkin was not a dinner napkin. The Greek word for it means sweat cloth. All right, it was what rich people used to wipe their brow. The idea of a handkerchief had not been invented yet. And that was something that, common men used later on. No, this sweat cloth was used by rich people to wipe their brow, or another word or use of it was at a burial, placed over the face. So this was not a dinner napkin. I'm sorry to bust that idea, but it was a sweat cloth. The real reason why this is my pet peeve is that this colloquial thing about the napkin detracts from the greatest moment in all history, because I think Satan's trying to cover up what really happened there by detracting from it with this other thing, because that was the pivotal moment when Jesus arose from the dead, and everything in the future became a foregone conclusion. It proved the legality of God's plan, because if it all worked, then Jesus could be raised from among the dead. And so he was, and the victory was won. And that is the moment of all time that Satan hates the most, because it was the moment that proved that Satan is doomed. And it was the greatest moment of all history. And what's really something is we see Jesus at this moment calmly folding a sweat cloth and placing it by itself. He wasn't jumping up and down. He wasn't raising his hands in victory. He wasn't shouting. He was just taking care of a detail. But that shows you a glimpse into his character, because he was disciplined. He did his due diligence. And you know what? He did everything that way. When he healed people, he did it that way. When he taught the word, he was thorough. He didn't leave anything undone. He did every detail. And so here he is, standing there at the greatest time or moment in all history, and he's folding a sweat cloth, because that's in character. And also when Peter came in and looked in the sepulcher and saw the linen clothes lying, he also saw the napkin, the sweat cloth, folded neatly by itself. And that was like Jesus' calling card. Peter said, oh yeah, He was here. I know it. So that's another reason why that napkin thing is my pet peeve. The next event is event 6.57 on Sunday the 18th, when Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. That was while it was yet dark. Mark 16:9 talks about this. Now, when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, that would have been Sunday early. So their Sunday began not at midnight, but it began right after sunset Saturday night. And he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils. And went she and laid and told them that had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And they, when they had heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, didn't believe. John 19:11, another account. But Mary stood without at the sepulchre weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the sepulchre, and saw 2 angels in white, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. And they said unto her, Woman, why are you crying? And she said to them, Because they've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back and saw Jesus standing, and didn't realize that it was Jesus. And Jesus said unto her, Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you seeking? And she, supposing him to be the gardener, said, Sir, if you've borne him thence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I'll take him away. And Jesus said unto her, Mary. He knew her name. And she turned herself and said unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. So, in his resurrected body, he remembered who she was. So we are going to remember who we are and who our loved ones are. Wow, that's wonderful. John 20, verse 17. And Jesus said to her, Don't touch me, for I'm not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken these things unto her. Now, this ascend to my Father is not the ascension that occurred 40 days later. And the touch me not. They touched him a lot later, didn't they? Sure. So what is this? Well, Jesus, because he had touched the Athanion, and also because he had touched the napkin, he was ceremonially unclean, having touched something having to do with death. So to be cleansed, he would have to go to the temple and make a sacrifice. And that is what this ascend was, because there was a euphemism about going to the temple, and they would say, I am going up to the temple, because going up was literally what they did. It was up on Mount Zion. So this going up, ascending, means that Jesus had to go to the temple, make a sacrifice, so that he would be ceremonially clean, and then they could touch him. So that's what that's all about. Oh, I can do one more event, I think. One more event. Event 6.58. This is when the women finally arrive at the tomb with the spices to rebury Jesus, but he's already up. That's Luke 24:1. Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they'd prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. They entered in and found not the body of Jesus. It came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. And they were afraid and bowed down their faces to the earth. And they said to them, Why do you seek the living among the dead? he is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and the third day rise again. So, the third day that he rose was Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday. So, the Saturday, the third day, was still in effect when just before the stars appeared. So he still rose the third day. And they remembered his words and returned from the sepulchre and told all these things unto the 11 and to the rest. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. Then arose Peter, ran to the sepulchre, and stooping down, he beheld the linen clothes in ceremonial position, and departed, wondering himself at that which was come to pass. See, the people weren't prepared for this. It was a great shock that their master, the Lord Jesus Christ, had been crucified and suffered such a terrible death. They were in grief and shock. They weren't thinking straight. And you can see their confusion here. So, Mark 16:2 is a parallel passage that says the same thing. And then also Matthew 28:5 through, through Matthew 28:9. So they're going to tell the apostles in Matthew 28:9, as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, all hail. And they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. So now they're touching him. So this must have been after he went up to the temple for making the sacrifice so they could touch him. And verse 10, then said Jesus to them, don't be afraid. Go tell my brethren that they go to Galilee, and there they shall see me. And when they were going, behold, some of the watch came into the city, and showed unto the chief priests all the things that were done. And when they were assembled with the elders, they had taken counsel, and they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, say his disciples came by night, and stole him away while we slept. And if this has come to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and secure you. Because if they actually had been sleeping, that was a death offense if they were supposed to be on watch. So, because they were the governor's soldiers, and so we'll persuade him and secure you. And verse 15, so they took the money and did as they were taught. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. So that's as far as we're going to go tonight. But this passage is full of all kinds of accurate things that you can see how the Word works and refutes the errors of tradition. Many people have seen the truth and come to the truth because they see the difference. So, thanks for tuning in tonight, and God bless you.